Schönen guten Abend zu den Cornelia Goethe Kolloquien. Im Namen des Cornelia Goethe Zentrums heiße ich Sie sehr herzlich willkommen. Mein Name ist Marianne Schmidbauer und ich bin die geschäftsführende Direktorin des kurz CGC genannten Cornelia Goethe Zentrums. Das CGC ist ein interdisziplinäres Zentrum für Gender Studies an der Goethe-Universität Frankfurt, in dem derzeit rund 70 Mitglieder aus 11 Fachbereichen versammelt sind und in Forschung und Lehre kooperieren. Auf unserer Homepage werden Sie über aktuelle Projekte und Themen informiert. Sie können sich über die Geschäftsstelle zur Info-Mailing-Liste des Zentrums anmelden und den Newsletter abonnieren, um auf dem Laufenden zu bleiben. Die Cornelia Goethe Kolloquien sind Bestandteil der Studienangebote in den Gender Studies, die das CGC plant und koordiniert. Für Studierende wird regelmäßig ein Begleitseminar zu den Kolloquien angeboten, das in diesem Semester von Dr. Marin Scheurer aus der allgemeinen und vergleichenden Literaturwissenschaft geleitet wird. Darüber hinaus sind zu den Kolloquien alle eingeladen, die sich für aktuelle Debatten und Themen der Gender Studies interessieren. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie unserer Einladung so zahlreich gefolgt sind. Falls es Ihnen im Laufe des Semesters nicht möglich sein sollte, an jedem Kolloquium teilzunehmen, haben Sie die Möglichkeit, die Veranstaltungen später im YouTube-Kanal des Cornelia Goethe Zentrums anzusehen. Nicht gerade am nächsten Tag, aber doch relativ zeitnah. Sie werden dort noch viele weitere interessante Angebote finden. Damit möchte ich schließen. Ich wünsche Ihnen einen spannenden Abend und übergebe das Wort an Martina Wernli, die Sie in die Konzeption der aktuellen Cornelia Goethe Kolloquien Ökonomien der Diversität, literarische Kanonprozesse im Umbruch einführen wird.
Ja, vielen Dank, Marianne. Guten Abend auch von meiner Seite. Mein Name ist Martina Wernli. Ich bin Germanistin, Literaturwissenschaftlerin in Frankfurt und zurzeit noch ein bisschen auch in Mainz. Ich freue mich sehr, dass es jetzt losgehen kann mit dieser Veranstaltungsreihe, die aus einer Zusammenarbeit herausgeht von sehr unterschiedlichen und vielen Leuten, mit denen ich zusammen eine Plattform aufbaue, die unter dem Hashtag breiter Kanon zu finden ist im Netz und wo Sie auch alle Beteiligten sehen. Und wir haben jetzt miteinander 7 Abendveranstaltungen konzipiert und in diesen Abenden werden wir diskutieren, welche Rolle feste Kanones haben, wo sie vielleicht auch im Umbruch sind, gerade jetzt. Literatur zeigt sich hier in einer gesellschaftspolitisch sehr relevanten Position. Mit ihr und in ihr werden Fragen der Macht, der Stimmgebung und Prozesse des Ein- und Ausschlusses verhandelt. Entsprechend breit sind die Bereiche, die wir jetzt auch abdecken möchten in den einzelnen Abendveranstaltungen. Kanonprozesse sehen wir beispielsweise im Buchhandel, bei Verlagen oder in der Kinder- und Jugendliteratur, um nur einen Bereich zu nennen. Kanonisiert wird mit Literaturpreisen und in Bildungsinstitutionen, wie es die Universität und die Schulen sind. Wie Sie gesehen haben dürften, sind es häufig mehrere Beteiligte. Das unterscheidet die Reihe vielleicht von anderen Semestern. Es sind häufig Diskussionen, die wir hier führen möchten, anstoßen. Sie sehen in unseren Hintergründen, wir haben sehr viel Buchmaterial, ungeordnetes, stapelweise. Auch bei Preciado hat sich unser Motto sozusagen ähnlich eingerichtet, extra für uns, und die Kolloquien zeichnen sich durch eine Ergebnisoffenheit aus. Also hier soll diskutiert werden. Sie haben auch die Möglichkeit, Fragen zu stellen. Das wird in dem FAQ-Section von dem Webinar geschehen können. Wir sammeln diese Fragen und nehmen sie gebündelt am Ende wieder auf, also dass Sie da einfach fortlaufend Fragen stellen können und wir die dann bearbeiten und weitergeben. Weil Umbrüche in Kanonisierungsprozessen sich auch mit der Frage nach der verwendeten Sprache und diese wiederum mit Fragen der Macht einhergehen, freut es mich besonders, dass wir heute mit Paul Preciado, einem Philosophen, den Auftakt machen können. Und damit gebe ich weiter das Wort an Bettina Kleiner.
Well, thank you very much, Marianne and Martina, for the friendly introduction, and Martina for the concept and organization of this wonderful lecture series that makes this evening today possible. I'm Bettina Kleiner. I'm a professor of education and gender studies, and I'm very pleased and excited to welcome tonight's main event, I might say, Paul B. Preciado, right beside me, to talk with him about his book, Ein Appartement on Uranus, Chronicles of the Crossing, auf Deutsch, Ein Appartement auf dem Uranus, Chroniken eines Übergangs, which appeared in 2020 in German. Paul is a writer, philosopher, and curator, and an internationally well-known thinker in the field of gender, queer, and trans studies. He studied with Jacques Derrida, also with Agnes Heller, and holds a PhD in philosophy and architecture. Paul has published internationally, and among his numerous publications are several books that appeared in different languages. In Germany, for example, Kontrasexuelles Manifest and Testo Junkie were widely received. Both contain a radical critique of a hetero and cis-normative society. Hi, Paul, and welcome everybody. Where are you, Paul, if not in your apartment on the Uranus?
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation. Guten Abend, and thank you, of course, Martina and Marianne for the nice introduction, and thank you as well, Bettina, for conducting this conversation with me. Well, today is a kind of I don't know if you already spoke about that, but it's a little bit of a special occasion for me because I have a Monday, this small operation on my eye. So basically, you will be seeing me this way, and I will be talking to you also the way I am now. But I have to say that I'm totally fine, and that I mean, maybe we can come back later to this question of basically how the body is represented and how also somehow the representation of sickness is always, in a sense, erased from representation, main communication or representation devices, right? So in a sense, well, I thought I had some questions in my mind. Should I appear in front of you this way or not? And at the end I said, well, I'm feeling well, so why not? You know, let's join the conversation. So yeah, I'm in Paris today in my apartment, but in a sense, I mean, physical spaces are always full of narratives and histories and textuality. So in a sense, they're also partly places of imagination, right? So sometimes, you know, when friends come to my house, or sometimes I tell them, in my house we can really live like if we were in Uranus, right? Like in that sense, that that's the I guess the way we can, all of us, redefine the space in which we live, or the conditions according to which we live in a certain space, or how we relate to that space, right? But of course, this reference to Uranus in my book, I guess it comes from a double side, from two places. One has to do with history, of course. It was something that appeared to me in a dream, and I've been taking quite seriously what is happening in my dreams, among other things, because historically, psychology and psychiatric thinking has, in a sense, captured the realm of dreams, right? We could say that in a sense we went from a kind of a mythical thought into a religious kind of thinking, and after the 19th and especially during the 20th century, psychoanalysis and psychiatric thinking had like almost a monopoly over that realm of thinking and expression, which is the dreams. Right. And so I've been trying to, in a sense, like reappropriate myself of that field of dreams and really like work with them as it would be like part of my philosophical thinking, in a sense. Right. So when I started, like I had a dream about Uranus, like basically that I had an apartment there in Uranus. And so all my questions were like, why am I dreaming this? Why it's not just like it doesn't have to do maybe with just like with the questions of having or not having an apartment, or just like, questions that had to do with property within capitalism and so on. Since basically for a long time, we didn't have any place. Basically, I've been like living in different places. So this could have been solved through that answer, which is related to property within capitalism, right? But nevertheless, I kept like thinking, why am I having this obsession with Uranus? And only later came to me, of course, that I've been studying like history of sexuality for like 20 years, right? But in a sense, I basically had forgotten that the first way in which I would say what at that time could it even be considered like non-binary people, and we can come back to that, because of course like the notion of non-binary didn't exist within the 19th century. We didn't have an epistemology of non-binary gender. We didn't even have the notion of gender. But what I think it was really fascinating is that those that had been considered sodomites and therefore were persecuted legally within the region, which is now Germany, by the way, but it was mostly the same in other parts of Europe, basically develop a language about themselves, created a language, which I think is quite fascinating, that is some of these notions that we now have almost forgotten were not totally invented or just invented by science and by medicine in order to normalize bodies, but some of them were also invented as tools of emancipation at the beginning of the 20th century, the last part of the 19th century, very precisely between 1864 and 1869. Mm-hmm. So you have all these amazing conversations between early activists in Europe. At that time, the most well-known were men, because were those that had the possibility also of expressing themselves and writing, right? So, and they claim this notion, they go back to ancient Platonic writing, and then suddenly they pick up that notion, which is still fascinating again, because it's like basically, how would you reclaim the right of living within a society that is considering like sexual practices between two people of the same sex, let's say, as being criminal? How would you reclaim the right for those people to belong to the political regime in which they live? And I mean, nothing more, I would say, like almost ridiculous, or it's like suddenly they go back to an ancient Greek thought, and then they pick up this notion of a Uranian and come back with it, right? Like it's almost like a cut up in history, right? Like you go to that Platonic notion, you do a cut up, and you take it out and you bring it into the 19th century colonial, highly patriarchal discourse, and you put it inside, and then suddenly it's almost like these notions are alive, right? And then suddenly they produce something else, and they're gonna really create something completely unexpected, right? Like basically within the following 20 years, you will have like all the scientific community, they have to position themselves in relation to these a small group of Uranians that are like making a lot of noise there in Germany, and trying.
And you might say at that point that, I mean, the Uranus is an extremely rich metaphor that you use for one thing to hint to Karl-Heinz Ulrichs, yes, who is the one who brought this concept up of the Uranians. But also I think it points somehow to a place of dislocation, because obviously your apartment there is not in this world, which I found also extremely interesting. And I think we come back to that later.
Yeah, maybe I just Bettina, I like to add something else, which is more related to the way in which we do philosophy, or we're trying to do philosophy, let's say today, right? Like in 2021. Which is basically, I mean, for a long time, if we think, for instance, about Kant and Hegel, and I'm going to go back to that far in history, but, you know, which is more or less, I mean, a little bit like earlier than the time of Ulrich that we've been speaking about. But anyway, like the the scope of the philosophy was extremely European, and everything that was outside of that framework was considered like basically like outside of reason. Even though, of course, this was a high moment of colonialism, right?
Yeah.
And then that framework is expanded during the Second World War suddenly, like, and especially if you think about Hannah Arendt or Gunther Anders. So I mean, everything that is happening during the Second World War, and then even more with Hiroshima and with like the end of the Second World War, like the framework has radically expanded, right? We cannot do philosophy anymore, like just speaking about Europe, right? Suddenly it's larger than that. And after the Second World War is even larger than that, because then the decolonial movement and the let's say anti-Vietnam War, and I mean everything that is happening is pointing to the margins of the cartography of the world. Like, so it's impossible by the end of the 20th century to do philosophy without taking the whole planet into account, right? And now it's something even different what is happening. It's basically like contemporary philosophy cannot be done without thinking about the cosmos as the only place from which we will be able to think now. Even though, of course, when I'm saying this, I'm not thinking, you know, I'm not pretending that I'm thinking from Uranus, but I'm thinking from already like the consciousness and the awareness that we are not alone within the universe, right? That is a complex system. And I think this is also super important, because basically like look into the history of sexuality, look into the history of political emancipation from the point of view of the cosmos and from the long history of the earth, right? Which is something that other people are helping us to do, like Anna Seen or Donna Haraway or Bruno Latour, like basically like trying to expand and think, well, this is like this tiny part of the history is just this small within a very long history of the planet, right? And I think that's, for me, is super important, because then I realized that notions of gender, of sexual difference, of racial difference have been invented extremely recently. They're like hyper modern notions, super recent notions that have been invented within a particular fraction of a capitalist and patriarchal and colonial development, right? Which, if we look at it this way, I think is, even though we're in a kind of very complex moment, the moment of COVID, the moment of like, it's like the Anthropocene and all these conditions of a crisis that, if we want to call it crisis, we could also come back to notions of, like, let's say, like political collapse or the collapse of democracy, right? But in this moment, basically, if we look at it from the long span of the history of the planet, and even more the history of the cosmos, maybe we start to think that it might be a way out. It might be a way of turning things down, because this has not always been the case. You know, it's like, I think that some of the problems that we carry with ourselves when we work on undoing gender oppression, undoing racial oppression, undoing, for instance, even the gender binary, is that is fixed in history in such a way that it has been naturalized, that we look, is like, has always been the same, and it will be the same forever, right? So trying to just like give a history to that, and to show that it's extremely recent, extremely modern, and that even within that very short period has already been like a huge contestation, a huge resistance, an amount of resistance that is unbelievable for a regime of this violence. I think it changes completely perspectives, right?
I think you described that also in your book, and I'd like to go back to the concept of the book, because I'm not sure everybody here read it. I think you described that this regime of gender norms is, beside the racist regime, one of the most violent. Your book contains, and I'd like to say that right in the beginning, Chronicles, essays that were initially written for the French newspaper Libération. What all these essays have in common is that they comprise several kinds of crossing or border crossing, and we will come to that. and that the topics that you analyze are reflected through the prism of your own transition. It helps us see other transitions, you might say. And for a long time, that is also something you describe in the book, you lived in a nameless space. You write, I quote, "When I began these columns, my name was still Beatrice, and although I was a dissident as a queer lesbian, I still occupied a social legal position as a woman. I'm ending this book still in the middle of the crossroads, signing with a new name and furnished with a new identity card, indicating my legal sex as male. In this sense, these columns have at least two authors. This dissonance makes visible the division of the author into a multiplicity of voices." And the transition that you described took place between 2004 and 2016. During that time, you described that you for a long time lived in between, but then at some point made up your mind to make a change. What interests me in terms of gender is what kind of agency do these spaces offer that are different spaces with regard to gender norms and to the violence of gender norms also.
Right. Yeah, indeed, they are indeed very different, right? Nevertheless, I find that I have not left the, let's say, the queer space, like, to put it this way, like a kind of a queer trans. I mean, among other things, because I'm not so interested in defining a very precise way of being trans, or what does it mean to be trans, or if trans is different than queer, if non-binary is more or less radical than trans. I mean, like, all these, let's say, identity divisions or segmentations are less interesting to me than the invention. Maybe invention is exaggerated, because it doesn't mean that you're like invented from scratch, right? But it means like basically like the collective creation, right? And it's never done alone, but it's always the collective creation of a set of strategies of disidentification, right? So in a sense, I could say that I had been placed in the position of being thought as a lesbian for a long time, right? Because I was already in a kind of disidentification with the gender regime in terms of being assigned woman, you know, as a female
birth.
gender at birth, right? So that was like the first like disidentification move. And then I think that when you are within this kind of disidentification, you become very conscious that identity is a political fiction. And when I say a political fiction, I mean, this is something that someone like, of course, like Judith Butler has already been working on, but I think that maybe we articulated that differently, or I had played with that differently in my work, but of course, inspiring myself a lot in her work. But when I say political fiction, it doesn't mean that these identity nodes do not have any reality, any entity. Is not the case. On the contrary, I mean, those are like very specific conditions. I would call them like biopolitical and necropolitical conditions of life, right? Like determine your possibilities of living in a certain society. But what I mean when I say political fictions is that they are a set of constructed relationships, right? So what is very funny is when you start like moving yourself, and that I think that's, and you use already the term agency, because it's not really like freedom. It's not like that you have the freedom of extracting yourself from a kind of a gender normative regime, and from the outside of that regime you decide, it's like, oh, am I lesbian, am I gay, am I trans, it's like, if you could like be in a certain moment fully outside of that regime. On the contrary, it's like your body, your desire, the way your practice is, the way you call yourself, the use that you do of language, all you are already entangled within a certain regime that determines your position, right? So, but as soon as you start like, in a sense, like making a small moves within these set of relationships, you realize like how many things are changing, right? I mean, some of the, I guess that in my case, some of the most complex ones, and I guess that that's why some of my fellow friends, for instance, identify themselves as non-binary, whereas basically, for instance, myself at a certain point, I took a male passport, and I now have a male, let's say, legal identity. And I think that is crucial. It's crucial to understand, for instance, that each of us, that, for instance, not just because you are trans, so not just because you're lesbian, not just because you're like, in a sense of basically like displaced in relation to the norm in a certain regime, but all of us, all identities have been the effect of a certain amount of political fiction inscription, let's say, right? Like, for instance, nobody can arrive to the world without a certain representation of this body and the gender of this body being made, right? And the same thing is no one can really like be in a world without a name, right? No one can, and I think that even if I say this, I mean, I think that, and I like to underline that, because I mean, for me, one of the most important things is to be, or to make ourselves collectively conscious that we are living through a gender, sexual, and anti-colonial revolution. And being conscious that we are going through this process changes completely also the agency, right? Because otherwise it would be like, you could also look at that process in a very kind of individual, medical or psychological way, right? Like basically, oh, how do you feel? How do you look at your own gender? What do you think that is your desire? How do you relate? And, so basically like, the language, the medical psychological language that has dominated gender and sexuality during the 20th century tends to make that process fully individual, right? And only related to yourself, which is what I'm doing is really the opposite. It's like showing that process is always already political, that is always already given in a set of institutional relationships, right? Being those institutions, I mean, it's like, of course, like there is always, even, for instance, even if we are very critical of heteronormative family, but for instance, we have been born in heteronormative families that stop being heteronormative the moment we're born. I mean, that's how I see it. Like, for instance, I don't think my family, like if I speak about my parents are now in their 70s and 80s, I don't see them anymore as heteronormative, because we have established a certain set of relationships that have undone the being straight. They cannot be straight anymore, because they have to basically like be able to shelter something that goes beyond their heterosexual framework. Like,
so what you say, and I think that is an interesting notion, is that a family with a trans or a queer child is also a different family, because the trans or queer child also shapes their agency. Is that what you want to say?
This is what I want to say, and that's something that I'm also experiencing now more and more. For instance, I'm very much now in contact with a lot of trans, like, let's say, children, right? Like basically, I would say trans children, in the sense that, which is extremely interesting as well. Like, for instance, before it was impossible. I mean, the basically like putting these notions together, like trans and children, this could not exist, right? So we're now in a different gender regime. Yes, we are. I mean, there has been a complete like radical shift within in the last 40 years, and therefore now a child can identify themselves, himself, herself, as trans, which is, I'm not saying that this is like a fantastic. I'm also want to look at that as from a philosophical point of view, and I'm saying that, well, this is a reshaping of the gender norms, and of course within this process of making a child trans, there are also like again a full like set of norms that are being like put onto the child, which is I'm living through that as well with many children that I know. But I also see, like, for instance, many parents that come to talk to me, they're like a straight parents, they have no idea what is like queer culture, and suddenly they have a 4-year-old at home, and then they experience that they have to, in a sense, depatriarchalize themselves, de-heterosexualize themselves, to be able to accept or to shelter, to welcome something that is happening to them, which is, I think, is very different that what used to happen before, which basically like most of the let's say queer or trans children were just ejected from the families, or fully like forced to become heterosexual or become normative in terms of gender, right? So,
yes, and still many families don't shelter their children, and I think you have the queer child plays a very important role in your book, but you also exactly point to that argument, I might say, that parents very oftentimes don't support or shelter their children, but what they shelter, like the anti-feminist discourse also, is gender norms.
Absolutely.
So in a case, they privilege gender norms in relation to the well-being of their children.
Yes.
And I think it even gets more complicated if you take an intersectional take on it. So what does that change, whether children are Black or are coming from a background where there's very little money? That's something I wondered sometimes about in your book. How would that play out for queer and trans children if you think about it in intersectional terms?
Okay, well, first, I like to say that the child became very important in my book. And it's becoming even more important in the book that I'm writing now, for instance, because in a sense, for instance, if we think about the 70s and even the early 80s, let's say that all discourses of sexual and gender emancipation turn around basically like the youth, right? Like the model of the youth, someone that was like already like in their 80s and 20s, and either was that, or either had to do with questions of abortion, that had to do with like the very, let's say, like understanding if something is life or not, and where agency starts in relation to life, right? But the child was not so much like at the center of those discourses, right? Even though, of course, like was the question of like let the child discover sexuality, that today will become very problematic as well, right? But what was fascinating to me is that precisely when I started to write in the journal, in Libération, when I started these Chronicles, the extreme right was like really like rallying on the streets, and they were doing that first with their children on like really like you know, like walking with their very young children, and at the same time doing this anti-gender campaign, which is very funny that the notion of gender itself became almost like the devil, right? Like many times, of course, like not even understanding what gender means and where this notion is coming from, right? But how the child had become what the extreme right was fighting for. It was really like preserving the sexuality and the gender kind of a purity of children, right? And in a sense, that was like a moment of war for me. That was a moment of war. I felt it as never before, as something that I could not allow this to happen. In a sense that I was born in Spain, still in a moment that it was a fascist society under Franco, and then it took like really like more than 15 years to basically like start the transition into democracy, which at the end was really the transition into neoliberalism, right? And so I was born in a society precisely where the child was this biopolitical bonus that the government and the state had to get attached to, and the child was the object of all violence and normalization, right? So in a sense, for me, that was even before the extreme right became very prominent. For instance, in Europe, for me, like seeing the child emerge in this way, I thought, okay, this behind the child, I know what is coming, right? There's always behind the child is always the extreme right, right? So I thought that was super important to really like jump on that fight and say, no, the child is unlike what you're saying precisely. The child is the object, the maximum object of violence, and therefore should be protected. If something from the state, from the family, from the pedagogical system, so it was absolutely the opposite, right? So because I guess that for many years, and especially also during the AIDS battles and so on, the child had been like completely away from our discussions, right? So I mean, more or less, right? It was really not the center of the debates, right? And
well, think of Sedgwick. I think some queer theorists already
absolutely,
very early
yes,
talked
absolutely,
about
absolutely.
children.
I mean, not to say that the child as almost as Uranus, the child was also like a kind of an imaginary horizon from which to think queer politics. That's for sure, like a kind of this radical refusal of the chronology of adulthood, right? Of course, so that is the case in many queer writers, that the child has become this emblem. But I think it was different what was happening in the early 2000s, in which basically it was not just like the child as utopian figure, but it was really like the child as a very concrete and physical object of fight and war between the anti-gender and the, let's say, queer and trans communities, right?
Mm. And then the argument of protection of the child, I think, is so difficult because the new right uses the same argument. And I thought it got nicely clear in your books that we should always ask the question, what exactly is protected there?
Yes.
Is it the child? Is it about the child, or is it about the norm? And is it about the norm in a way that makes the child a guarantee for normalization, a metaphor for the nation, and also a metaphor for purity, so to say?
Exactly.
That's something
exactly. Yeah, and I guess that looking at the child this way, you can also maybe ask feminism, contemporary feminism, to move a little bit forward from what they've been doing until now, right? Because in a sense, I guess that it seems crucial, for instance, to demand the right not to identify children when they are being born, right? So to start thinking about the representation regime of the gender binary as the first form of gender violence that is basically like imposed on babies or on newborns, on children, right? So, and I think that will give a very different portrait of feminism and contemporary feminism, because it seems that, for instance, when we speak about trans feminism now, and I myself, I'm speaking about trans feminism often, but most people, when we speak about trans feminism, they're thinking only about the question of trans women being accepted within the female community or the feminist community. Should they be accepted? Which for me, I mean, I have no doubt. I mean, trans women are women and should be are part of the feminist movement. But also, I mean, for instance, like trans men or non-binary people can also be part of a feminism where the object is not just the emancipation of women, but the fully undoing of the binary regime, which is a different kind of feminism.
Of
right?
course, and I think we talked about that before, and also about the fact that for this kind of more inclusive feminism that you're talking about, which is exactly not identity politics, but so much more, it would also be necessary to change the, you said, grammar we work with. Like we need a new understanding of reproduction. We need a new understanding also of care, which also very oftentimes is connected to the heterosexual family. And I think you wrote in your book also about a definition of reproduction rights. That is a very different one. You might want to say something to that.
Well, I think, again, from a philosophical point of view, I'm trying to think about the body differently, right? And I think that the body and the way the body has been thought, it is a problem consistently, even within feminism, because it has been thought as an anatomic object and as a property, both things. So even, for instance, in the language of let's say when feminism say, oh, my body is my right, so my body belongs to me and everything. Okay, well, unfortunately, I mean, those are beautiful slogans, but unfortunately, this is not the case for anyone, right? Basically, like, so I'm,
and it has always also been very different for Black and white women to come back
absolutely,
to the
absolutely. But I think absolutely,
Mm-hmm.
yes, and I think that it is more interesting to think about the body already from the beginning as a political technology. I'm speaking about the body as a somatech. I call it somatech, like basically like a kind of a political living archive, right? And which is already a historical ensemble of techniques, right? And the question is like, what techniques? I mean, it's like that's what is changing in the way I'm trying to think about within feminism and also within contemporary philosophy, is instead of starting with identity to then like basically like undo identity, what I'm trying to do is like not starting with identity, but starting with the technologies of the body that produce a certain subject, right? Like, for instance, how masculinity historically has been constructed is just like through the monopoly of the technologies of violence, right? Like the same way that basically like the state is the monopoly of all of use of techniques of violence in society. Well, we could say almost the same in a kind of a parallel way within patriarchy, for masculinity, right? So for me, instead of basically getting obsessed with questions of how to do with masculinity and femininity, the question is like, what are we going to do? How are we going to redistribute, transform, modify these technologies of violence? What can we do with them, right? And start to identify those in a very precise way, because for me, otherwise even I have to say, for instance, even questions of intersectionality that come now very often, and everything has to become very intersectional and so on. Yes, but if intersectionality is just like taking again, like, okay, now we have like femininity plus questions of race, but questions of class, but questions, it's like, okay, fine, but what else, right? So for me, instead of taking that approach, which still is relying on very much on identities, what I'm trying to do is basically thinking about the technologies, the technologies of the body, the regimes of representation, what I call the technologies of producing truth that allow for a certain kind of subject to emerge, right?
Well, but also I'd say it's not just about identity, it's also about power, about systems of oppression. And I mean, how would you say are these systems of oppression connected to the technologies? Because I think that's the question we should should ask. And also second, you say we could do this or that. I mean, coming from, I'd say, a perspective that puts subjectivation in its center. What is this agency about? So what are the connections between oppression and technology? And also, what is it that can be done? What is the agency that we have?
Right. Well, but the thing is that I am not myself making a difference between oppression and the technologies that oppress, right? So it's a very, I mean, I guess in this respect, I am I could say like I'm a kind of a reader of Foucault that has gone into like, you know, like cyborg theory and Donna Haraway, and also like working a lot with architecture and contemporary technology as well. Like I look at sexuality from the point of view of the history of technology. That is my approach, and it's not that I'm not. Which makes, for instance, that instead of thinking about like these regimes of power as something that is like a monolithic and stable, instead of that, right? What we have is like just like a very complex entanglement of techniques, right? And then we can start like having a very precise conversation. It's like instead, for instance, this is what I was trying to do when I was like analyzing, for instance, the pill, the anti-baby pill, for instance. It's just like, okay, let's for years, for instance, I had spoken with feminists, and the white feminists, they will never understand why like non-white or racialized women were opposed to the pill. But of course, like when you scratch and you go directly into what are these technologies and how are they working, you realize that the pill, of course, it can be a technology of emancipation for certain women, but has been historically a hygienic technology for the regulation of the growth of considering non-white races, right? Especially within the context of colonialism and then in the US, right? So, for instance, if you, and for me, that's is 100 times more powerful that being lost in like battles between like basically like the pill, yes, the pill, no, well, I mean, what is the pill, right? So it's I have this approach that I call like thinking about what was happening in the 80s when basically the people that were sick, that had been sick with AIDS at the beginning, and of course at that time they didn't have any hope for survival. They were proposed to participate in text in which basically they were given the choice between, of course, there was like not without knowing, they could get the ACT, which was like an active principle, or they could get the placebo, right? And in front of that decision, which is, we have to see those as two techniques, very, very concrete techniques. And we could say the same now in relation to what's happening with vaccines or what's happening with COVID and everything, right? So very concrete technique. What the activists from ACT UP, they're gonna say is like, well, we don't know, but we need to open these pills and get to understand what is inside. And when we know, we can decide. So agency can only be constructed, in a sense, through understanding the technologies that are constituting ourselves, right? So what the patients of that time are going to be doing is basically opening up these pills, analyzing what is inside, and they decide if it's a placebo, they throw it away. If it's an active principle, they actually put it in half and they share it with someone else. So to share the possibilities of survival, right? I think that's a fantastic example of this is not abstraction. It has to be like going down into very precise knowledge of the technologies that are constituting ourselves. I think that is the same today with the notions, for instance, the way we're working into the criticism of the binary gender regime, right? What this binary regime is producing today is such an amount of epistemic and institutional violence that we cannot continue this way. It's just like, it's not, you know, this is a social, like a universal social question. This has to be changed. Has to be transformed. And for that, we need just to collectively decide, like modify those technologies. It's like, well, we might find ways of not assigning gender at birth. And these will transform by, you know, like basically like as in a row, this will transform the pedagogical system. This will transform every institution. Well
Germany, right. Sorry, we have these ways already to say there's no assignment of gender. Do you have that in France?
Well, not yet, for instance. But what is now happening in some cases is that you have like basically like gender assigned as male, female, and you have the opportunity of saying, oh, right, on non-binary, which is still, I mean, it's a very interesting, it's already a crack within this epistemology, right? But we do not have yet like a kind of a large scientific and activist consensus. And this is something that for me is also very important, is that most of the notions that we've been using in terms of the sexual and the gender and the anti-colonial political movements, all these, many, not all, but many of these notions have been crafted by science, by modern science, that it was, of course, at that point, like a pretty patriarchal and colonial regime. So sometimes like criticizing this regime and doing these norms has to do as well with transforming science, right? And as many of us were saying now, we need to bring activism within science and change the perspective, right? Like fully try to collectively invent a new grammar, new institutions, like probably these institutionalized certain institutions. Yes, if heterosexual families, or for instance, if the church, as has been now the case, prove like it's basically a space of an enormous amount of sexual violence, well, this has to be disinstituted. I mean, it's not just...
So what would you say is the task of science in terms of societal change? I think that's a very interesting question. Absolutely. I mean, for the university, especially.
Well, I think it's not a question of being like against science, like basically as kind of fully opposing to science. On the contrary, but what we know, especially those that we come from like these histories of technologies and history of science, is that science has been co-opted, like especially during the 20th century, enormously by the market, right? So and through this relationship to the market has been working also according to this identity logic of colonial and patriarchal regimes. Like basically, like, I mean, if you, whatever study that you look into now into contemporary sciences, I mean, unlike, let's say, if you get into cybernetics, which is a different thing, we haven't talked about that today, but it's fully fascinating because this is opening up like a completely new regime. But clearly sciences are still working at many levels with notions and with hierarchies that are coming from the colonial and patriarchal regime, and those have to be fully criticized. And I cannot see other ways of doing it as basically bringing activists and critical, not just the sciences, but critical cultural analysts within this production of knowledge, right? So,
well, and at the same time, at the universities, we have this discussion that there, of course, must be a difference between science and politics. So well, yeah, I think that's quite complex, right?
But politics, when we say the difference between science and politics, I agree on that. But what I mean is that within the scientific committees, there should be activists. And I think that this is going to be more and more the case, for instance, if we think about ecology and what is going to be happening in the following years, is that what are we going to be doing, for instance, with nuclear technologies? What are we going to be doing with fossil energies? I mean, I think those questions are exactly the same as gender issues. The question of fossil, for me, for instance, fossil technologies equal heterosexual binary regime equals race difference. This is a package. So we're going to have to disentangle this package altogether and collectively invent other ways of producing life on Earth, right? Otherwise, I think that, well, that's not going to be, we won't be very successful, you know?
Well, I'd like to come to two more different points before we give the audience some space to ask you questions. And I'd also like to ask you some questions on this topic of border crossing. First of all, I discovered that many places in your book, you made analogies between gender migration and flight. And I myself see some incongruities here, like the gender migrant has documents that do not match the body, the refugee has none. The possibilities of passing are certainly distributed differently. In gender transition, the transition takes place on the body. For refugees, the body is first of all the instrument to cover a distance that needs to be passed, so to say. Against this background, how would you describe the relationship between gender migration and migration that comes up frequently in the book? And how does this special connection to the experiences of refugees come about?
Well, it's a very complex question, because for some reason, maybe because I don't know, maybe I didn't do it well in the book, but for some reason, it seems that the readers don't see like two different regimes that can be connected, but they see the analogy as just an equation. Like gender migration is basically equals crossing of borders, and it's not equal, absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, what was interesting, well, first, it comes from a personal experience, really, of just getting to understand that when you are like transitioning at a certain point, your identity papers are obsolete, and you find yourself without passport, without being able, you don't even have anything else, because now is if you don't have a passport, you can have like a credit card, which is like the, let's say, the other side of a passport within capitalism. But once you're transitioning, you have neither of both are useful to you, right? So you basically are on a kind of a identityless in relation to those, I would say, like institutional prostheses that construct political identity, right? Like you have none of those. And then what was interesting for me is that at that moment, you are in a kind of waiting place, in a kind of in a waiting room of democracy, right? It seems that democracy is like, oh, fantastic space, but suddenly you discover that democracy has like big holes. And of course, like being myself like European, having a European passport, being let's say identify mostly as by people, even though I'm from Spain, so I'm not always white. Depending on where I am, I can be considered non-white, but mostly in, you know, like, so being in a position of privilege, right? Suddenly, like transitioning equates losing those privilege brutally, right? Like from one day to the next. And in that moment, I suddenly made myself conscious of those holes within democracy. And it's like those holes are not outside of democracy. They are not like beyond democracy. They are like within democracy itself. It's full of holes, right? And then it was just like because of the physical encounter, really, like through not having papers and being like waiting for these papers to arrive. It was just like through physically being in a sitting room with people that are waiting for their papers as well, and trying to understand if they will be assigned to Germany, to Greece, or to, because that's the way some of the refugees and the migrants, and in this case, I will not make differences between refugees or migrants, even though this is a discussion that I had also with many refugees and migrants themselves. And they made themselves a lot of difference between, for instance, people that are exiled and that have been forced to leave their houses. Like if we speak about Palestine people, for instance, that have been fully forced to just like leave their houses, or exile, they're being exiled from other places, and people that are migrating, because even if it's economical migration, but they make the decision to actually like leave their place to go somewhere else, right? So it's not exactly the same as when you're gender transitioning, because sometimes you're like forced to do that. But it's true, what I for me is the strength of that analogy that can have many problems, but is for me the only strength. And then if it's problematic, like, please, let's give let's remove it. And it's not a question of how would I say, I think that the experience of migrating and the experience of being a refugee or being exiled is fully, I mean, it's really like a specific, and it has like, and should be defined in a specific places. But what I think is interesting is really just like through those positions, right? Like trying to almost like draw the cartography through which citizenship is constructed. That I think is interesting. And to realize that those positions have to do with the body in relation to the nation state, right? And that's super important. And the trans body is dislocated in relation to the nation state. It's like, this is something that I never imagined before. I didn't think about that before, but it's like, yes, gender transitioning, it puts you at odds with the nation state, right?
And does it so just while passing, or would you say it also does?
It does, no, because basically gender transitioning is, I mean, this is also something that is super important, is that, and I also do say this in the body, is the trans body is almost like the migrant body, is the object of all surveillance, of all study, of all like anatomic dissection. I mean, the object of course, like all violence as well, but it doesn't exist. It's the same that, for instance, the migrant body doesn't exist as a political subject in itself. It has to be recognized, has to be recognized as migrating from a place to another place, so from a nation by another nation, but it doesn't have a political, let's say, entity by itself. There's no political ontology, to put it this way, of the migrant body by itself. And the same way, there is not a political ontology of the trans body by itself, right? It's basically, we are considered, until we fully enter within the, let's say, all masculinity or femininity, or we define ourselves as non-binary, but still you have to be in relation to those definitions, inscriptions, and institutions, right? I think that it's interesting in relation just to redefining the limits of this political regime, right? And
at the same time, I think that we agree on the fact that it makes a big difference whether there is a Black refugee trans body or whether it's a white trans body. That's a different question, so to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is absolutely not the same. But what is interesting is to just realize that this regime is very specifically defined in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of class, and that those are like, and that those differences exist as non-places within democracy. That's what I think is really fascinating. It's like, for instance, Calais or Melilla, they're not outside of Europe. They are in Europe, right? Nevertheless, they are like spaces of destruction of political agencies, like of non-consideration of political agency, right?
And I find the term "there's holes in democracy," I find that very well expressed, so to say, that there's such spaces within democratic countries. Let me ask one last question, and then I'd like Martina to come back, who has somehow vanished behind the poster, to bring in the questions of the audience that have gathered here. My last question is on the language. I think holes is it reminds me that I wanted to talk to you about language. You said you wanted to use philosophy as fiction, and that you are striving for new narratives. And I think border crossing can also be seen very much on the aesthetic level of your book. I found that very fascinating. You cross political analysis, literary and fictional writing, poetic language with theory and philosophy, making many references to Foucault, Butler, Glissant, and others. And I wondered also making up neologisms like pharma pornography that are very heavy-duty metaphors, so to say. I wondered, what does this genre crossing offer you?
Well, I guess that you know, at some level, and I think this happened already with my first book. I realized that, for instance, I was writing like papers and things like that for the university. I have a PhD, so I've been trained as an academic writer in a sense, right? But I also see that as a genre. I see academic writing as a genre, right? No, but it's important to recognize that, because once you see it as a genre, you can also play with it, right? If you don't, otherwise it seems like it's just like the objective way of describing things, right? So I do not have that relationship to language. I always see like the kind of language game into which I'm being inscribed, like, and for instance, each of my books, they do play with different language games. For instance, the Countersexual Manifesto is very parodic, is almost comical, and it takes the model of the manifesto, which is really like avant-garde and male and whatever. I mean, all these things to really speak about, like among other things, about like dildos, right? So it's so from the beginning, I wanted to play with that. I could say like, okay, I want to do a manifesto, but about dildos, right? Like what that would be. And with, for instance, with Testo Junkie, I was also very conscious of the language game, in the sense that I knew that I was rewriting kind of protocols, and that protocols of substance use, and that was a genre as well that had been used before me by many people. Especially, it's a very kind of modern genre that has been used by Bulgakov, by Freud, by Benjamin, by, there are like hundreds of authors that have been using the model of the protocol. So that gave me from the beginning the kind of a structure in which I wanted to write, or I don't know. I mean, in this case, for instance, in the book that we're speaking about today, is really like the Chronicles, which is basically, and for me, the Chronicles, I was very much inspired by someone like Pedro Lemebel, which is a Chilean writer and kind of fiction writer, but also very political. I mean, now he's not with us anymore, unfortunately, but he was extremely political, and realized I had to use the media to be able to fight his political struggle for kind of indigenous queerness in Chile. And I think that's the same thing that happened to me, in a sense that at a certain point I had to say, well, I mean, how many people will read like Testo Junkie, right? I mean, it's impossible. I mean, most people won't, they will think, well, what a strange book. I mean, they will never read it. But they suddenly like the power of basically having a journal like Libération, that people like open it up and then suddenly you find like someone is speaking about, like basically like the trans condition and questions that have to do with intersectionality, or like queer radical battles or whatever. I think that was, so basically in that case I was really like using that genre of the chronicle. And the new book that just came out in English, that is called Can the Monsters Speak, it plays with a different genre as well. It uses the model of Kafka's essay of the monkey speaking in front of the community of scientific, let's say, wise men, right? So I mean, like, but I think that I just would like to say to the people that are hearing us that yeah, philosophy is absolutely not like a mirror of knowledge. Absolutely not. It's another language game, and I think that I mean, as much as I have learned and loved, even like some of the professors that I had in the US and the kind of the American university, which in a sense we all play with that model now, right? It's a very narrow model, academic writing. So yeah, I don't think that full like expression and knowledge and transformation of discourse can happen within that. It's really a small framework, right? And also, of course, like I come also from studying with Derrida, which the more I'm growing old, the more I'm thinking like, oh my God, like I mean, Derrida is like coming back to me more and more, as of course something that I was completely like a character building for me, because I was a very young student for many years with him, and I think that in a sense, yeah, I would say like science fiction, feminism, and then Derrida kind of allow me not to be scared of using other genres to write philosophy. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. Let's take that as a last word on this part, and I take Martina's appearing as the start of our conversation with the audience. Thanks a lot, Paul, for this
Thank you so much, Bettina,
inspiring and somehow wild talk that we had here.
Thank you so much for the questions and for reading the book. Thank you so much.
Well, I loved it. You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you too. I've collected some of the questions and I'm trying to shorten them and sum them up. First one is concerning the concept of love. You are asked whether you could talk a little bit about love as is there only desire and love as a governmental technologies of bodies, or is there something that we can still lean on and carry on, such as romantic love or parent-child bonds, or is this just something we have to get loose on and deal with it?
That's okay. If you don't mind, instead of you asking me all the questions, I will like answer them. How much time do we have, by the way?
How much time
I think it's about 15 more minutes.
Okay, 15 minutes, good. Just like not to basically expand too much on each question. Well, I mean, I think that love is extremely difficult to tackle, because it's one of the dominant, I would say, like almost like opaque political notions. It's a notion that is fully political, but it presents itself as absolutely like personal and intimate, and of course as well is if we think, I mean, from the let's say from the Greek up to through Christianity up to contemporary world, I mean, there are like several notions of love, or all of which have been, I mean, we could like discuss many of them and find them like highly problematic. But what I would say is that in a sense, I'm more interested in notions of desire than in notions of love as such, right? Like basically, like in terms of the kind of language that I use in my work, I'm trying to understand desire as something that is politically constructed, and therefore like something that has to do with both a discipline of subject production, but that can also be let's say transformed or reinvented or recoded, right? I mean, I don't know, there is a hype now around love, I think that, I don't know if it was like the COVID confinement or something like that, but now they're like, for instance, France is now like completely full of love, of books around love and why we should love each other, and why, I mean, like heterosexual love is very problematic, but we should save it. And I mean, so there is moment, and at some moment, I don't know, at some moment I might write something about it, but I don't have a full and serious answer to give yet. And also this year has not been a good year for love for me, I have to say. It's like it's true, apart from my dog, that is really like a love bomb, but
you promised with the eye that would have been enough, you know. So.
Exactly, absolutely.
It's not only this one. Okay, next question is about social media, the role of social media as inscriptions of political fiction. Can this happen in the digital realm? For example, social media, do you think gender effects online will or maybe are already becoming standardized?
Yes, well, this is super important. We haven't really spoken so much about this today, even though I think it's absolutely crucial, because I'm really interested in kind of like kind of drawing the shift that is happening from this epistemology that we've been talking about today, which is really like mostly constructed through the last 5 centuries of a colonial patriarchal capitalism, right? And a shift within this epistemology starts to happen after the Second World War, and with the introduction of new technologies of subject production, some of which have to do with biotechnologies and with chemical technologies, but also with cybernetics, and of course with the internet. And yes, of course, I cannot even imagine how we could think about gender today without including like cybernetic technologies as part of the technologies of gender production. That's for sure. One of my insights on this is that social media and the market, both of them, and then we will another big discussion that we will not be able to have today, but that is fascinating, is what is the difference between the internet and the market today? I mean, is internet the market, or like the extension, the let's say non-physical extension of the market, and therefore it's just like the space of cyber capitalism, or is something else, or is there within that space the possibility of something other than that? But within that realm of the internet, what is interesting is that the social media have become technologies of truth production. I mean, until, like, for instance, I mean, if I say technologies of truth production, you're going to think, like, what is he speaking about? It's like suddenly like the technology of, well, like if you think about, we were speaking about, Bettina and I, we were speaking about like about this transition, let's say, from mythical and religious thinking into the sciences, and how basically like most notions that have to do with gender, but also with race, were developed within this scientific and technical model, mostly between the 18th and the 20th century, right? So we could say that for a really long time, the sciences were the main technology of truth production. This doesn't mean that there were not like other ways of producing truth, but that was the main one. Well, now the opposition is not longer the kind of the confrontation, the traditional confrontation between religion on one side and the sciences as these two technologies that oppose to each other in relation to the production of truth. Now there is a third term that is equally stronger to both of them, or even it could become more strong, which is the social media and the internet. Right, and this opens up. I mean, the fracture was already happening when the media, as such, not the internet and the social media, but media, let's say, from the time of journalism in the 19th century, later with the development of TV, for instance, in the 50s, when the media became a really strong technology of truth production, right? But now it's not the media anymore, but it's really like social media, which I think allows for a complete different way of producing knowledge and producing truth, which is extremely interesting. It is, for instance, could we think would have been the case that the Me Too movement, the Ni Una Menos movement, the Me Incest movement, I mean, let's say the kind of a strong movements of a contemporary feminism would have happened without social media? I mean, this is a big discussion. I don't think this would have happened the way it has happened. It's impossible. I mean, it doesn't, I'm not saying that what is happening on the streets and the performative dimension of movements like La Tesis or Ni Una Menos is not important. It's really, really extremely important. But this would not have had the planetary effects and dimension that is having without social media. So we have this very complex position of social media at the same time as a technology of surveillance and becoming eventually a critical technology of emancipation. I think the same was happening, for instance, with the use of mobile phones, right? I think that the mobile phone, at this point, we can no longer consider that as an external technology. I think that very soon we will have to consider phones as organs of the human body, right? Like basically that will be legislated as the use of the hand is legislated, right? Like for instance, are we allowed to film a policeman or not? At a certain point it would be like the same question that it was asked in the medieval time when we would say like, are you allowed to look at the king or not, right? Because the position, what the mobile phone is now is exactly what the eye was in medieval times, right? So I think that what also is happening now is that the body is being fully recomposed, right? I'm speaking, for instance, of telebodies, of bodies that are constructed through teletechnologies, in a sense that what is happening today, right? Like we have a kind of a conflation of different regimes of constructing the body that are happening at the same time for this conversation to be able to just occur, right? So, but let's say maybe I stop here.
Okay, thank you. We have another question on the relation of sexuality and ecology. Mm-hmm. If you could maybe speak a little bit more, if a queer perspective as yours can offer, what can this perspective offer?
I think that, I mean, I'm not a specialist on political ecology. I mean, I don't have the knowledge that I have, for instance, on the history of sexuality. But what I can say is that it seems to me that one of the problems of contemporary ecological fights is that they are still working with a metaphysics of nature that is extremely naturalist, right? And that therefore is a metaphysics that is also very much relying on patriarchal and colonial knowledge, right? So in a sense, for instance, we speak about nature, but nature is an abstraction. It's a category, it's a notion that belongs to the colonial patriarchal formation, right? I like very much, for instance, when Bruno Latour describes human technology as being part of our nature, right? That's, I mean, how we understand nature. I mean, it's like everything that surrounds us now, like for instance, cities our nature and environment as much as the Amazons is a nature for the people that live in the Amazons, right? So I think that trying to forge a notion of ecology that is not essentialist, naturalistic, and that is not based on a patriarchal understanding of nature is going to be crucial, because otherwise what we could find very easily is like a kind of an unexpected or maybe expected alliance between the extreme right, for instance, and certain ecological political movements, right? So I think that yes, we need to create a kind of a radically leftist eco-feminist trans decolonial ecology. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for all of this. I think I hand over to Bettina once again.
Okay. Good.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for this lively conversation that, of course, didn't follow the script. But was a lot of fun and also very interesting. Although, of course, it wasn't possible to go into detail. I think that would have taken the night to discuss all the issues that came up, possibly points where we don't agree or do agree.
Absolutely.
That is a shame, but it's let's say, the character of this kind of colloquium that we have here.
Sure.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm super happy also to continue the conversation, and and also, well, sometimes just like through conversations, and I thank you as well, because sometimes through conversations you open up also like different ways of looking to what I'm doing, and sometimes it's right after like a conversation like this one, I go into writing something like differently, thanks to your insight. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. That's Foucault again, right? Like you become different while you write. So
absolutely.
we conclude with this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
You too. I will close now by announcing the upcoming event in November and switch to German for that. And I guess you can follow anyway, Paul.
Absolutely, yeah, it's fine.
Genau, wir müssen diese Veranstaltung heute schließen. Wir sind fast am Ende der Zeit, konnten jetzt leider auch nicht alle Fragen aufgreifen. Ich möchte Ihnen allen danken dafür, dass Sie dabei waren und die kommende Podiumsdiskussion ankündigen. Am 10. November findet nämlich im Rahmen dieser Reihe eine Podiumsdiskussion statt, in der das Thema Trans auch in einer anderen Art und Weise wieder aufgegriffen wird. Die Podiumsdiskussion findet statt zwischen Linus Giese, der in seiner Doppelrolle als Autor und Buchhändler bei uns sein wird. Linus Giese hat das Buch geschrieben, Ich bin Linus, wie ich der Mann wurde, der ich schon immer war. Und die Podiumsdiskussion findet statt mit Lina Mozur, Leitung des Hansa Berlin Verlags, und der Moderatorin und Literaturkritikerin Miriam C. Genau, Trans wird fortgeführt. Zusätzlich geht es dort um die Frage, wie Kanonkritik in Handel und Verlagen funktionieren kann. Wir laden Sie und euch auch zu dieser Veranstaltung ganz herzlich ein und wünschen jetzt einen schönen Abend. Tschüss.